Good afternoon. It's 5 o'clock and it's time for our favorite thing, Science Cafe. Yay! The director of Science Cafe is not in town, and so she's appointed me, part of her science cadre, to host the ceremonies today. And luckily, it's a good thing because I'm from the Department of Geological Sciences. My name is Elizabeth Gerlowski-Cordish. I'm a geologist, so it's appropriate. I first of all have some things that need to be announced, and the famous Roxanne Molly Bruni, who was featured in the Post yesterday on her work at the research office, will make the announcements.
Hi everybody, happy Wednesday. Okay, how many of you have had exams this week? Just raise your hands. Okay, how many of you are just trying to get through the semester? Raise your hands. How many of you do not need one more thing on your to-do list? I'm about to give you one. Sorry. Summer. Summer is approaching. How many of you guys are planning on flipping burgers this summer? Meaning fast food jobs. Raise your hands. Don't be shy. Oh, goody. No one? Yay. Okay, what I'm here to convince you to do is to go to the ohio.edu/fellowships website and click on the summer internships. There we are trying to list a bunch of different opportunities, both here at the university as well as abroad. So we're trying to convince you to go have fun in somebody else's lab at somebody else's expense this summer. And if you have any need of help, feel free to contact me. The next Science Cafe is going to be Deb McAvoy. She's in civil engineering, and she is a safety engineer. What does that mean? Well, basically, she looks at highway safety and traffic operations, and she has this driver simulator. And I'm hoping that she's actually going to do it here, blindfold you guys, get you drunk, whatever, and actually make you try and use it. It's a lot of fun. So that'll be good. And then we will have one more Science Cafe after that, and that will be Dr. Kopchak, who is one of our researchers over at EBI. He will be talking something about biotechnology, I am sure. The last announcement that I have is many of you guys are students, and I know that you want to support your fellow students, so the library is actually hosting something similar to the Science Cafe. It's going to be Tuesday, November 19th from 2 to 3 p.m., and two students from the School of Communication Studies are going to be talking about, let's see if I can find it here, underrepresented populations. So their research on underrepresented populations. So if you want to go hear about their research from two students in communications, Alden Library, November 19th, 2 to 3 o'clock. Welcome to Science Cafe.
Okay, let's get down to the real stuff. I'd like to introduce Dr. Alycia Stigall from the Department of Geological Sciences, our major paleontologist, who teaches paleontology, and she's going to talk about her research on invasive fossil species.
All right, okay, that works. All right, so thank all of you for coming. I haven't used wireless mics before, so I'm a little sketchy about it. So if I'm too loud or too quiet, let me know. But I'm used to kind of projecting and talking animatedly in large classrooms. So I hope I don't talk too loud. So, okay, what I'd like to talk to you about today are some aspects in general of oceans of Ohio, which you really can't see behind me. But if you could, this is a fantastic reconstruction of what the oceans look like here in the, well, not right here, well, actually kind of here, but the rocks that record this era are actually preserved over by Cincinnati. And so what I want to talk to you a little bit about today are some of the rocks that are preserved over there, more specifically what's going on with the organisms preserved in those rocks, and then what that can tell us about with respect to modern problems. So, basic disclaimer, I grew up in Cincinnati, and so while I'm going to tell you that these rocks are among the most beautiful in the world, I'm slightly biased, but not wrong. These These actually are phenomenal rocks. And I brought some that you can see later. I brought some fossils that are out of rocks as well as fossils that are actually still within rocks. When I teach introductory paleontology, a lot of times I get students in my classes that haven't been out collecting fossils. One time I was taking a group that involved some education majors, and the night before the field trip, this girl had been out at the bar with her friends, drinking too much because we had an 8 o'clock departure. But nonetheless, her friends had convinced her that she would be out all day and not able to find a single fossil, because her friends were of the opinion that all fossil collecting is similar to the types of things you see in Jurassic Park, where you're out, you're looking for dinosaurs, you're looking for a big bone, but instead, all you find is a bunch of sandstone, and you just keep walking for days and days at a time. That's actually not really how vertebrate paleontology works either, but it is an idea that people have about the way paleontologists work, that we go outside, we put on our rugged clothes, and we're gonna cast some bones and bring them home. And that's not at all how most invertebrate paleontologists or even vertebrate paleontologists work. The way I work is that I go outside, I find as soon as I step out of my vehicle, a rock, something like this, and in here there are 30 fossils that you can see with your naked eye. Without preparing, you can actually identify them. And if I go to a different rock layer, I can find this rock, and this rock has the remains of about 200 organisms just on the surface. And in fact, the entire rock is just full of skeletal remains of organisms. So these, So these kind of rocks that we have out in Cincinnati, and a lot of the skeletal fossil deposits that we look at when we're looking at invertebrate fossils are like this. They're tremendous rocks. Now those in Cincinnati, I've already said, are really extra spectacular, and that's true. When you go and you look at rocks in other time periods and other places, you spend quite a while looking for a fossil. But that is not what happens around Cincinnati. So how many of you are from southeastern Ohio? So Cincinnati, Dayton, the area over by there, northern Kentucky, Indiana. So you guys know what I'm talking about. You probably grew up in areas where if you just go to the stream in your neighbor's backyard, you can pick up a pile of fossils. And it's great. It's a great way to grow up. And so as a kid, I had lots of fossils and stuff like that, but I didn't really know what they meant. I just knew that it meant there was an ancient ocean there. But I didn't realize that that could actually tell us something really important about the world that we live in today. And it really can. And this is why we study paleontology. I mean, it really is fun to look at ancient dead things and think about what they were like as animals, think about the environments, like draw pretty pictures like this. And that's really fun. But the reason that we do it isn't to stop there. It's actually to go forward beyond that and think about science that is actually impactful in our current world and with current problems. And so the problems that I work on, I've got some slides that I don't plan really on showing, but I like definitions, and I'm a visual learner, so here's the definition we're going to work with today. We're going to talk about invasive species, and all of you undoubtedly are aware of invasive species. These are species that are not native to the area under consideration. So let's say Ohio. These are things that did not evolve in Ohio. They're not part of the local ecosystem, but they live here now. And in the modern world, that's usually because humans have transported them. And so one of the big invasive species here in Ohio are zebra mussels. So these guys in the middle that you can't really see. But zebra mussels are these types of clams that moved in ballast water of ships from the Baltic area, and then were basically released. And the larvae grew on the seafloor and populated and moved everywhere. And zebra mussels today live in regions throughout the eastern United States and all the way to the west. Actually, they're starting to populate the West. And these are species that aren't from this area. When they moved into the Great Lakes, zebra mussels like to grow on top of each other in their growth mode. So you start with a clam, then it'll grow another clam. And what happens is that they actually change the entire substrate of the areas where they live to basically be hard. It's just a pile of hard shells, where the original substrate was actually nice and soft and muddy. And things like insect larvae that are native to this area really liked that. So it's negative and can be a negative influence for the local species. And that's why we worry about it. Invasive species are these species that are not native, and this is the federal definition. So these are species that are not native to the area under consideration and whose introduction causes harm to the environment or harm to human health. And in fact, within the United States, there's about $120 billion every year that is spent on combating invasive species. So these are a major problem. Now, we obviously, because these are such a problem, modern biologists and ecologists worry quite a lot about them. And so there's a big question of how can we control them? What are the features that are an invasive species? And there's a lot of really high quality research done both here at Ohio University and elsewhere by many of our faculty that are interested in these questions. But there is a real problem with studying only modern environments. Well, you can only study them for a few years at a time. And in fact, if you even want to study them for your entire career, then maybe you've got 40, 45 years to study them. And that is actually not very long. The Earth has been here for 4.5 billion years. Animals have been here for 450 million years. And in fact, if we want to talk about a 50-year window, well, that's very short. We actually realistically, as humans, really want to understand about the future of our environment. What's it going to look like in 100 years? What's it going to look like in 200 years? What are the steps we need to take now to make sure that things are good in the longer, short term, but in the longer realm? And we honestly can't understand all of the dynamics we need to know simply from looking at modern animals. And that's where the fossil record comes in. Because in the fossil record, we have 450 million years worth of animals. And things like invasive species have happened before. Now, they weren't always due to humans because our species hasn't been around that long, but we can go farther back in time and we can see similar patterns. And that's what we're looking at in Cincinnati. We're looking at rocks that have, the rocks around Cincinnati can be broken down into six time slices. And the first 3 time slices have organisms that look the same. We have the same community structure we call them, we're very creative with our naming. We name these sequences C for Cincinnati 1, C2, C3, C4, C5, and C6. Okay? Pretty straightforward. So C1 through C3, the lower units, look exactly the same. The abundance and the community structure is consistent throughout the 3 million years of that time. But then, during the C4 sequence, things change. At that time, we have a suite of invaders. They come in. They didn't evolve in the Cincinnati region. They come from elsewhere on the continent of Laurentia. Now, at the time, I'm just going to show you a picture of what the world looked like. You'll be able to see a little bit of it. Okay, at the time, this is black and white, so it's good. At the time, Laurentia was here. So North America was a continent called Laurentia. It was basically North America plus Greenland. And it was tilted about 45 degrees from where it is today. And you can also see Cincinnati was about here, Ohio was here, and we were in the southern hemisphere. So what happened at this time was that because we're one of these shallow seas on the continent, if global ocean levels go up, that can actually bring organisms in from other basins. And so that's what happened. When sea level's low, there are these kind of bumps on the continent that actually stop species from spreading between basins. And when sea levels go up, they can come in. And so during the C4 sequence, sea level went up, oceanographic patterns changed, species came in. We had an invasion. It's very much like a modern invasion. The species that move in do not have ancestors in the Cincinnati region, and they're new to the ecosystem. And just like those zebra mussels, the environment shifts. And after that invasion, the seafloor community looks entirely different than it did before. So what I want to talk to you about today is what happened during that invasion. What happened to the species that were there before the invasion? What happened to the species that came in during the invasion? After that interval when everything was crazy and wild and the invasion was happening, what happens afterwards? And whether or not that actually has lessons that we can take from that and actually extrapolate out to the world today. So to do this, we're going to need some props. So I'm going to pass around a card. Now I want everyone to take one card and then just pass it to your next door neighbor. So it's kind of like a test in class. Everybody take one, pass it on. I have a whole bunch of these. Here, start a stack back there. Okay. Yeah. Oh, we don't need these. No. If they're in certain sets. Yeah. Okay. All right. pass them back. Great. Okay, now as these come around, what you're going to see, most of you, those of you who don't have one yet, here's what you're going to get. Those of you who have one, here's what you're looking at. What you have is a card with, starting at the top in bold, is the name of a species that lived in the Cincinnati region sometime during one of those 6 depositional sequences. And then it's going to tell you what kind of a thing it is. So we've got native or invasive, and then the type of animal. And I'll talk about those in a minute. And then beneath that, it tells you how it behaved in the environment, whether it was an ecological generalist or ecological specialist. Okay, so let's start off by talking about who these animals are. This was an ocean, so yes, there were plants, there were things like algae and all that good stuff. But let's just talk about the animals, because that's what we're going to focus on in our exercise. All right, so starting off, these are the main types of animals that we have. And so we have at the top, we've got a gastropod. That's a snail. So there are lots of snails out there in the ocean. We have these weird things. These are called bryozoans. Bryozoans are colonial animals. They're very small. Actually, this is a colony of thousands of individuals. And in fact, on top of here, there are these itty-tiny pinpricks. You can't really see them on a slide. You couldn't see them even if the room was completely dark, because they're so small. You really have to have magnification. But each of those pinpricks was the home of an individual animal. And these are really cool animals, actually. They have this thing called a lophophore, which is kind of this fan that they use to filter feed. They're really interesting animals. They're still around in the oceans today, but you don't really think about them much. They don't comprise a substantial component of the seafloor today, but they did in the Cincinnati time. The next group is my favorite. These are the brachiopods. Now, I know that when you look at this brachiopod, you're thinking, well, that looks like a clam. But that is wrong. That is very wrong. They are not like clams. This is a clam. So I want to tell you, first of all, if you're out fossil collecting, how you tell the difference. It's symmetry. So when you look at a brachiopod, the 2 halves of the shell, the right side and the left side, look the same, like your body. You can run a plane of symmetry up and down. These 2 sides look the same. If you look at a clam, that's not true. In a clam, it's actually the 2 shells that look the same, the right shell and the left shell. In a brachiopod, the 2 shells themselves look different. Now, that's just their exterior, but it turns out that they're really different animals. So you guys are pretty familiar with clams. They have, gills. They dig with their foot. You can eat them because they have fleshy parts, so oysters and all that kind of stuff, mussels. Brachiopods don't have fleshy parts. They don't have gills. They don't have feet to burrow. Instead, they have very little gushy tissues. They're mostly just this big shell, and inside they have a structure, just like those bryozoans had, for filter feeding. And they're really neat. They're called a lophophore. They're very fun. Now, on the Cincinnatian seafloor, these are the dominant shellfish. So today, if you go to the beach, you're going to get a bunch of clams, right? And that's very boring. But if you went to the seafloor in the Ordovician, or any time between the Cambrian and the Permian, for 200 million years of Earth history, these are the dominant animals that you would find. And they're the dominant things that you see in a rock. So if you pick up any of these Cincinnati rocks here, it's mostly bryozoans and brachiopods. The ocean looked a lot different back 450 million years ago. Now, other key things that you'll find, that's more brachiopods because I love them so much we need more. These guys are cephalopods. So a cephalopod is, imagine a chambered nautilus, but stretch it out straight. That's actually what these organisms are like. So a giant squid, or a squid, but put a shell on it that's straight. So these guys were the predators. In the seas around Cincinnati, there were no fish. They were alive on Earth, but in other places. They were not in this area. So these were the top predators. And some of these cephalopods could get to be, as long as this table. So they could be some pretty substantial predators. Okay, so those are most of the organisms that you have, except for, of course, crinoids. Crinoids are these things. Their common name is sea lily, but nobody really calls them that. I don't know why that's their common name. What these guys are pretty much like is a starfish on a stalk. So take a starfish in your mind, lay it on its back, bend its arms upward, and then stick a stalk on it. That's kind of what a crinoid is like. And then these guys are filter feeders. They wave their arms around and they collect plankton out of the water column. Typically when you find them, it's the stems, and the stems have fallen apart. So you usually find these little Cheerio type things. That's a really cool thing you can't see. And then the last thing that's really important are the trilobites. So the trilobites here, this is Flexicolemene. This is the one everybody finds all the time. And this guy is Isotylus. This is our state fossil of Ohio. They're like this. They're big. This is Isotylus maximus. There is a species of Isotylus that got a little bit bigger up in Ontario, and they named that one Isotylus rex. About 5 years ago. It was pretty entertaining. But these guys are great. And these guys are, again, we're pretty good predators on the seafloor. Okay, so now you basically have some background to think about the animals on your cards. So now go back and look at your cards. All right, got cards. I can get all of them. All right, so everyone's got a sense of what kind of animal you are. Does everybody understand what kind of sort of lifestyle you might have had? Are there any questions about who you are for the purposes of our game? Okay, good. All right, so now I mentioned, first of all, that we have this big invasion. So everybody who is a native species, raise your card. All right, great. So we've got pink and blue are our native species colors. Awesome. Cards down. Who is an invader? Okay, you guys. All right, and those are yellow and orange. All right. Now, as we come through, let's see what happens to our native species. All right, native species, we're all out here. I said that we did nothing weird or different for 3 million years. Our native species were hanging out. Everybody was happy. And then in come the invaders. All right, native species, raise your hands. If you're a native specialist, put your card down. You all went extinct. Sorry. Okay, so we have native generalists left. That's who survives into the invasion. All right, now invasive species, raise your cards. All right, somebody who's an orange invasive species, what kind of invader are you, specialist or generalist? Generalist. How many invasive specialists do we have? Okay, a few. Now those of you who are Retorsi rostra, put your cards down. You go extinct. All right, so the invaders that I didn't drive extinct, put your cards back up. All right, you guys are mostly generalists or mostly specialists? Generalists. Okay, native species that are still alive, put your cards back up. All right, so around the room, everyone with a card up, with the exception of 2 cards at this point, are all generalists. This is, okay, you can put your cards down. Thank you. This is actually a really important thing to pay attention to. One thing we need to pay attention to is who survives and what are their parameters. What is it about different species that allow them to survive? So one thing that we've just quickly discovered was a specialist generalist pattern. But let's look a little deeper. Let's see if we can find any other patterns. Trilobites, put your cards up. All right, our trilobites are a mix. We have pink specialists and blue generalists. So some of our trilobites went extinct. Some of our trilobites survived. So it's not a function of being a trilobite that gets you through. What about our brachiopods? Brachiopods, cards in the air. All right, again, our brachiopods. We've got brachiopods that go extinct. We've got brachiopods that make it through. So brachiopods are not the answer. Sadly, some had to go extinct. Bryozoans? Any bryozoans out there? You went extinct. We have an extinct bryozoan over here. That one made it. All right, good job. So our bryozoans, again, we have both categories of survivors and extinct group in the bryozoans. Let's see, what's another group that I haven't covered? Oh, bivalves. Bivalves. Cards up. Our bivalves make it, annoyingly. They all make it through. Let's see, what's else? Cephalopods. Cephalopods? Some cephalopods go extinct, some cephalopods invade, some cephalopods make it. Let's see, gastropods. Some gastropods go extinct. That gastropod sticks around. That gastropod makes it. So again, a mix. So my point is, and I think you basically got it right now, yeah? That it's not about what kind of animal you are. It's not about what phylum you belong to or what major group of animals you are. It's much more about what type of ecological animal you are, whether you are a generalist or a specialist. So in case I didn't define those terms, and I probably should have earlier, so let me do that now. A generalist, an ecological generalist, is an organism that can make a living in a lot of ways. So they can utilize a lot of different food sources, or they can occupy a bunch of different substrates. So they can live in muddy environments or sandy environments, or they can live in hard environments. So the point is that these generalists, they all do it a little bit differently, but all of them in general have pretty broad characteristics of the different ways that they can make a living. Specialists are the opposite then. These are things that are restricted to a very specific set of parameters as far as the way that they make a living in their world. And so those are the species that have a hard time once the invasion occurs. Now let's go back to the modern world for a minute. Let's list some species that you know are in danger of extinction today. Hands up, or just shout them out, either way. Cheetahs. Cheetahs are a problem. And they're a top predator, so they're not very common in the environment. And they're relatively specific to the type of environment that they live in. Spotted owl. Spotted owls are another specialist. They've got a very limited set of conditions. Giant pandas. Giant pandas are so specialized. Okay, who's next? Yeah. Polar bears. Polar bears lay sea ice. They've got terrible, terrible conditions of needing really specialized environments. Yeah. I'm sorry? Yell really loud. Elephants. Elephants actually have reasonable population sizes at the moment. But they live in some pretty specific environments. They do live across an environment that occupies a large area right now. Yeah. Indiana bat. I do not know what its problem is, but those have a real problem with viruses too. So yeah. California condors. Those have funky problems from being really big and food problems too. So yeah, these guys are pretty specific. So can anyone, yeah. Black rhinos. Those guys are so sad. Yes, again, a pretty specialized type of animal. Can anybody think of really, really generalist animals? What are some generalist animals that you know? Cockroaches? Yeah, they're everywhere. Yeah. Raccoons are doing great. Flies. Flies is a really diverse group, but houseflies are pretty generalistic. Deer, white-tailed deer. These guys are everywhere and definitely not in danger of extinction. Okay, so I think that you guys get my point. The issue here is that the problems that we see in the kind of major groups that are having problems today coping with changes in the ecosystem were the same types of animals having problems in the past. Now today, modern invasive species are a huge problem in the ecosystem, as we talked about, but it's not the only problem. Today we have problems with habitat degradation, where humans come along and chop down rainforests, or humans come along and build subdivisions, and all these different kinds of things that impact things in somewhat different ways. That's a lot about contingency, if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time for these animals. And also we have problems with pollution and things going up through the food chain. So it's not all the same in the modern, but certainly understanding invasive species can give us some additional insight. All right, so good, so you'll understand that. Now the next thing I want to talk about related to this specialist generalist issue is about how species form. We've been talking about extinction, but extinction is only one parameter of biodiversity. When we start looking at the long-term history of life, we've had extinction forever. Extinction is part of life. Extinction of species is the same as death of individuals. You know, if here in Athens or Ohio or the United States, every day there are new babies born and there are people who end their lives. And this is the same thing with species. There are new species born, that's called speciation, And there are species that die, and that's called extinction. And just like we have in population turnover, we also have species turnover throughout geologic time. And that's just part of the natural cycle of history. However, there are intervals in time where we have dramatic levels of extinction. These are the mass extinctions, things like the end of the Cretaceous, where a really big asteroid comes and hits the Yucatan Peninsula. That causes excessive levels of extinction that are outside of the realm of normal. And there are other intervals like that too. But there's also another phenomenon that the other side of the coin is speciation. And speciation is in fact just as important as extinction. Because if we drive species extinct, which we always do, and we do it even worse than usual at mass extinctions, but we don't have new species forming, then what happens? Let's say you start with 10 species. It's a mass extinction. So you wipe out 7 of them. You've got 3 left. How do you fix that? What do you need to do to get back to a diverse ecosystem? You need some speciation. Bring those numbers back up. Well, what if speciation stops? Well, then you stay at very low numbers of species, low diversity for a long time. And this is actually something that I've been working on quite a lot, is what happens to speciation throughout geologic time, and specifically, what happens to speciation in the face of invasive species. We actually, as paleontologists, have a pretty good handle on extinction metrics. It's pretty easy to track extinction because it's just about things dying. They're there, they're stopped being there. We can actually see that in the rock record. And it's easy to tabulate, do fancy math on. It's really fun. And people do a lot of that. But it's actually a lot harder to study speciation because speciation is actually about something being born. And just like a baby, a human baby, before you get actually born, there's a whole process where you go from becoming a species. And so to become a species, what needs to happen is that you start with one ancestral species, and it occupies some area and has some number of individuals. And then some of those individuals have to become separated from the ancestral population. They have to, usually there's a lot of physical isolation, but it doesn't have to be. But let's say that there's a barrier. Let's just say a river. Let's say we're a mouse species. And there's a river forms here. And now these mice on this side of the river can't breed with the mice over there. So there's a physical separation, and then over time, over many generations, the isolated population and the ancestral population actually develop a little bit differently because the environments where they're located are a little bit different. And through geologic time, they change a little bit in ways that are different. And so eventually, over enough generations, these two populations can no longer interbreed. And that's usually what we use as a definition for species, the inability to successfully interbreed. So that's how speciation forms. It's a process that's slow. And by slow, I mean in human terms. It actually usually, we think, takes somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 years to really effectively get a new species. Now, this comes back to what I said before about biology being amazing, but having some limitations in the amount of time it can read. That's longer than we can study in biology. So we actually have to look again in the fossil record. And in the fossil record, we still have a problem there too, because most layers of rock are about 5,000 or 10,000 years. So speciation in the rock record tends to look like it just happened in a single layer or a couple layers because of the lens of preservation. But it's longer than we can see in the biology world. So in the biology lab, we could get some Drosophila, we can mess with them, we can do some selective pressures, and we can watch them change. It's great. We can actually cause these things to happen. And you can make it happen a lot faster in a lab than it would actually happen in real life. However, seeing the full process effective is actually really hard to do in biology. So we go back to the fossil record. Now, when we look at these intervals of speciation, it not only matters kind of that this thing can't breed, you need to know where it came from, so where its ancestors were living. At the event of speciation, just like the event of birth of a baby, happens at the same place that the ancestor lived. You can't have a baby born in Columbus when the mom was still here in Athens. It doesn't happen. So you actually have to have them physically together at the instant of separation. And so we see the same process. So we try to look at that and how that works. Now, I said that usually in speciation, there's a physical separation in space. That can happen due to one of two primary processes. The first is called Vicariance, and that's what I was actually describing before, where we had this big ancestral population, and then the river came through and passively subdivided these two populations. In the modern world, in the development of the modern fauna, that's about 75% of speciation events. It's really common. The other type of speciation is dispersal. That's where the ancestral population stays here, but some subpopulation actively migrates. So I should stay on screen. Okay, so the ancestors are here, and then there's some sort of like jump, and then the subpopulation is over here. Now, this is actually a pretty big gap in space, and it has to be a few members. You can't just have a single individual move, because then you can't reproduce, you don't have new species. You actually have to population move to form a new species. And so that process of dispersal is not common today. It's about 25% of speciation events that have been described in the modern. When we go back in the fossil record, and we look at times like the Cincinnatian, and we look at this interval of the invasion, there are a couple of interesting things that we see. The first thing we see from a speciation perspective is nothing, which is interesting. But for the 1 million years that follows the invasive event, or it's actually a couple pulses of invasion, but for the million years that follows that invasion, there are no new speciation events. It just stops. And then after that, after the community restructures and it's basically dominated by the invaders, after that, we actually see speciation resume. So there seems to be something about the invasive event that actually stops or basically depresses, is the word I like to use, speciation. Now the reason for that goes back to the point we've already covered. What kind of species are left after the invasion? Generalists or specialists? Generalists. All right, you're a generalist. You move slightly to the side. Well, maybe there's a physical barrier between the ancestral population and the descendant population, but if you're generalist, then what you're doing over here is pretty much the same as what the ancestor is doing over here. And it actually is really hard to effect a change that actually results in a genetic split. Because let's say you're separated for 5,000 years. Okay, but then you come back into contact and you're a generalist. So you can still do what they're doing and they can still do what you're doing and no new species. Specialists, it turns out, have a much higher rate of speciation throughout the fossil record in all sorts of different clades, not necessarily my work, but everybody's work, that studied these types of questions. And so when you take the specialist out of the ecosystem, you actually effectively reduce the speciation rate pretty dramatically. Now in my work, we see this in the Cincinnatian, but it's not the only place that I've been studying this problem. Speciation and invasive species are kind of the key thing that I do as a paleontologist, the things that keep me up at night. And so I've looked at other intervals. One of the intervals I've spent a lot of time looking at is the late Devonian. This is one of the big 5 mass extinctions. It turns out, really, guys, this is exciting. It's not a mass extinction. Extinction is high, but it's actually not different than that background extinction I was telling you about. It's actually statistically the same. What's actually happening is that speciation stops. Guess what's out? Guess what there's a lot of in the late Devonian? Generalists. Generalists specifically what kind? Invasive species. Yes, you guys get it? Okay, so this is a pattern that we see repeating throughout geologic time. When we have a lot of generalists, when we have a lot of invasive species, we actually have a much reduced rate of speciation. Now, in the modern world, let's go forward in time, back to today. In the modern world, we have a lot of invasive species. So and we've already talked about the fact that extinction is a real problem in the modern world, and for multiple causes. So what do you think is going to happen long-term with speciation? We've got a lot of invasive species. It's going to be high, low? What's your guess? Low, yeah, sadly. So this is the bad news that I want to tell you today, is that there's a lot of extinction going on, and that's bad. But it also turns out that there's been a lot of extinction at many other times in Earth history. And every time, life has rebounded. The survivors always re-speciate afterwards. And we always come back, and we've had 5 major mass extinctions before now. And look how cool our world is. It's pretty great. And so just because there's a really bad interval of extinction doesn't mean that after we get rid of the people, that life won't return. It will. It'll look different. It always does. But the problem, another problem associated with this, is this potential decline in speciation. So if what we're really doing in the modern world is driving the specialist extinct, and with this raft of invasive species, it looks like not only are we elevating extinction, and papers have actually looked into how high extinction is. It is higher than at other mass extinctions in the geologic record. But we're also going to depress speciation. So the rebound from the current mass extinction is likely to be protracted. And again, we've had this before. The Perma-Triassic took about 10 million years to bounce back from. Current thing might be about the same. Depends on how long humans keep messing with things, really. We're pretty amazing invasive species on our own. I would like to also point out that from a hominid evolution perspective, Homo erectus was a pretty bad invasive species too. That guy got around. Didn't make it to Antarctica. We're better at it. But we're not the first Homo species that has been actually actively dispersing around the globe. Okay, so that is my dominant point related to Cincinnatian fossils. So I think that one of the things that's really, I think, fun is that we can look at these fossils. As I said in the beginning, what we really want to do is look at the fossil record as a way to help us understand the modern. It's fun to play with fossils. It really is. I would like to tell you a lot about brachiopods all night long. It's really neat. Most of you probably would not be that enthusiastic about it, though. And I understand that point. So what's really fun, though, as a geologist, is that I study fossils that we have thousands of specimens of. So one of my favorite fossils is this one right here. This is a species called Platystrophia ponderosa. A lot of you guys here in my paleontology class, we went out to one of my favorite outcrops. Everybody came home with a complete one. I mean, it's not that hard to find these. I have hundreds of them in my lab. There are thousands of them left at just this one outcrop. And so because we have such good data, because we have such large sample sizes, there are a lot of interesting questions we can ask about biogeography, about evolutionary trends, and things like the types of things I've been talking to you about tonight that aren't as easy necessarily to address with all groups of fossils. So I think they're really fun. And I can tell you some more stuff if you want to know about like what happened. So those invaders come in. And the question is, so okay, I just said some of those things survived, right? You had a blue card, you were a native species that survived. But you didn't necessarily keep doing the same thing. You had to make some changes. You had to accommodate those invaders. And so actually we've done a lot of work looking at modeling the niches of what were the environmental parameters of these species. And we actually, I just gave a talk at a meeting like last week where we were talking about, kind of what we've really learned. And what we've really learned is that the native species that persist do so by narrowing their niches. So they take that initial footprint of things they could do. And once the competition with the invaders begins, they actually narrow down what they were doing to the subset of it that they were actually most effective at. Which makes sense. If you're going to compete with someone, you keep doing what you're best at. Now, this is why the generalists could survive, because they were able to contract and still be effective. The specialist species didn't have that luxury. Their niches were already small. We can quantify that, actually. And when they try to contract, and they do, they try to contract before they go extinct, they run out of room. They contract so much that they can't retain sustainable population sizes. And that's why they go extinct. It's a function of this niche footprint. And the invaders that come in are already generalists, so they actually do the same thing. They actually contract their niches alongside the native generalists. They actually all do the same thing as they're kind of fighting their way to build the new ecosystem. So I think that really is informative about what we can think about going forward as far as modern things go. When we think about some of the ways you could think about employing this is one thing, of course, is within a conservation framework. So we want to, as scientists and as humans for a variety of actual reasons that are economical, it's important to conserve aspects of the environment to the extent that we really can. But to do so, that requires investment of resources. And resources, in all cases, just like in the Cincinnati and seafloor, are limited. And so you have to decide what you're going to choose to invest in. Some of the implications of the work that I've been doing, at least to me, indicates that the very tightly specialized species are unlikely to succeed in the future 100 years. And they're also unlikely to speciate in the future, even if they did succeed. So it's more useful to take conservation risks, and you don't need to worry about the generalists, because they're going to survive. So looking at species with somewhat of specialized but not extremely specialized niches are probably a more useful investment in long-term sustainability issues. So polar bears are really cute. And we might have polar bear babies coming at the Columbus Zoo. The female polar bears might be pregnant. But that may be the future of polar bears. Zoos may be the future of polar bears, which is sad. But because we're a smart species and we can do things like maintain other species effectively in zoos, your kids might be able to see them for a long time to come. And that's pretty exciting. So with that, I'd like to kind of invite you guys to come up and play with fossils. I've got lots of different things. I've got invaders, I've got non-invaders. Yes.
Okay,
I'm sorry.
Before you start?
That's a good point.
Speciation?
And I've got
I have a
brachiopods.
question about speciation.
Yeah.
So humans basically have two mechanisms that I can see where we would induce speciation. One, we tend to manipulate the environment
Yep.
quite a bit, and so we cause disruptions. But also we have a tendency to take a certain species and transport it to, for example, like rabbits to Australia.
Mm-hmm.
So what are the differences in speciation between those two mechanisms? What are the results?
Right. Well, it
I'll
varies.
repeat the question.
So no, okay, so yeah, good point. So Roxanne was asking, so humans, when we're transporting species, this or manipulating environments, this actually could be fodder for speciation. So if you take an environment and you actually subdivide it, or make a national park here and here that are actually separated parcels, for example, that actually could result in speciation. That's true, it could. If we maintain that stability for 5,000 or 10,000 years and the species doesn't go extinct before that happens. So yeah, that could happen. But because of the shifts in the climate, areas that we protect and are good habitat now may not be in 100 years. And then the areas that are next to it that would be the new good habitat may not be protected. And so as the climate is shifting, there are some problems with the biogeographic range issues on that front, which is why that's not super likely to cause a lot of new species. The other issue was dispersal, where we take, let's say, introduce rabbits to Australia. Those rabbits are not breeding with their home ranges. Could they result in new species? They could, but they're generalists, so they're going to be slow about it. Yeah.
What about species that are close enough related to a species like polar bears and grizzly bears?
Okay, so then there's a question about whether or not we can have some kind of crossbreeding, polar bears and grizzly bears. They can interbreed. And what happens when you do that actually is that the genetics blend, and so you kind of lose the distinctiveness of each. That's actually one of the things that we see. We see it with fishes too, with introgression of the genomes, and that's usually in the conservation world that is often considered to be a negative impact, but it does preserve the genome in some respect.
Does that muddy the definition of species then, when a polar bear and a grizzly bear?
Sure.
Okay.
Well, the definition of species is muddy.
Yeah.
I teach my paleo, I had a bunch of my paleo class here. I teach them about 5 definitions of species because there's no hardcore explanation. In theory, we like to talk about species being genetically isolated in that they're not exchanging genes. In practice, plants interbreed across families, and nobody really runs breeding experiments of most modern animals to tell if that's really the case anyway. So usually we actually define species based on morphology. If they look enough different from specific characteristics that are static, we usually define them that way, whether they're fossil or modern. Yeah.
What actually causes generalists to species? What kind of events or stressors?
Well, okay, so the question is what causes generalists to speciate? They must do it sometimes, and they do, but it usually has to be a pretty good separation of space and time. It takes longer for enough changes to manifest for them to not be able to interbreed. And so a lot of things like, let's say at the end of the Cretaceous, we drive a bunch of things extinct, but we also start fragmenting Pangea, and things ride away on different plates for long periods of time. That kind of thing can happen, can result in speciation. Yep. Yeah.
Thinking about why an invading species would outcompete a native, I'm a little confused by that. If the environment is changing to the detriment of the incumbent,
Right.
you could see, okay, they're having a hard time now. But if it's more just the transportation of this invading species comes in,
Right.
it would feel like inherently the incumbent, we'll call it, is more naturally adapted to that place.
It
than
is.
the invader would be. So I kind of think they would outcompete rather than the invasive species
Right.
getting such a toehold and taking over. So why is that?
Yes, well, so the question is, well, so you bring in these invaders. Why is it that they're outcompeting? Are they necessarily outcompeting the native species? Because the native species, they're well adapted to this particular environment and this set of conditions. So if there isn't an additional environmental shift, would you necessarily expect the invaders to be more successful? And the answer is no, not really. There is no direct reason that a non-native species would outcompete. What happens in reality are a couple of different things. But I should start by saying they don't immediately do it. It's a slow process. So when we see invaders coming in, there's usually a lag phase in biology that we can see for a couple decades often before the population actually really expands in the invader. But part of the reason invaders can do well is from things like adaptive release. So in their home area, they had some other species they were interacting with that may have been a deleterious interaction, there may have been predation, there may have been specific diseases. And in the new environment, they don't have those limitations. And so that can allow them to expand their populations in ways they may not have in their home range. And those native species are in check with the other native species. However, the generalist native species usually do fine. The ones that have broad niches seem to do fine with respect to the invaders. The main times that we see in the modern direct issues caused by invasive species are usually predation, where you get a new predator comes in to what is a naive ecosystem. For example, Guam. The brown tree snake moves in. There were previously no ground-dwelling predators, and so a lot of the native birds just nested on the ground. A lot of those birds are now extinct. And so that's a predation interaction. In the competitive framework, it's a lot slower, and it seems to be more of an impact on specialized species, and the native generalists seem to do fine. Oh, yeah?
How do genetically modified organisms affect speciation like salmon?
Okay. Yeah, so the question is, how do genetically modified organisms like salmon impact speciation? Well, it's hard to say. When we genetically modify them, effectively what we do is stop them from being a natural species because there are certain parameters that are really good for agriculture. And so we're actually shifting those parameters. We also, with genetically modified species, try to keep them constrained. So we try to keep them within our agricultural systems and therefore hopefully not doing anything weird like speciating. Occasionally they do get away, and they'll interact with things that come into the area. But for the most part, there's not really been a lot of information about that. There is some introgression. So we're talking about the polar bears and the grizzly bears where you can get these species crossbreeding with native species, and that can result in the dilution of the native gene pool, and in that process, actually the loss of specific genotypes. So you can lose diversity, genetic diversity, from inbreeding with things like that. But it hasn't been really well studied yet. That's a good question. Yeah? Hi. Hi, Eric. It's a good question. So the question is, how do you infer if something is a generalist or a specialist from the fossil record? Well, we have to make some inferences. And realistically, what we do is we look at the geographic range of the species, and then we look at the environments across that region in which it occupies. So if you see an organism, a fossil species, that's occupying, let's say, shallow marine and deep marine, and sandy and hard substrates, then we would classify that as a generalist. If it's a species that we only see in one particular type of environment, we would classify it as a specialist. Yes?
So you said that typically the geologic timeline for speciation is about 5,000 years. is that dependent on the lifetime of that species?
Yeah.
And if so,
Yes.
then how about, what happens when you have like invasive insects, which have a much shorter span,
Yeah.
and a lot of them are specialists? How
Yeah.
fast is it then?
That's a good question. So I said in the fossil record, it's often about 5 or 10,000 years for a new species to form. And so Roxanne's question is, does that relate to the life cycle of a species? And so yes, organisms with shorter lifespans have more frequent reproduction, and then you would expect them to be able to fix genetic changes much faster. So yeah, you would absolutely expect more rapid speciation in those groups.
Okay, any other, oh, we have another one.
Yeah.
Is there any evidence that any species have changed their niches or so, but then
Yes.
eventually gone back?
There is a lot of research on niche stability and how stable a species is in its niche through time, both in the modern and the fossils and in the near modern fossils. So particularly things in the Pleistocene, there's been a huge amount of study of what's really, where the refugio and the glaciers were here and things like that. And so it's interesting because there's a lot of argumentation among the modern biogeographers about what's happening. And so they think that niches are generally stable. My data shows that that's not really true, but so does some of the modern data show that that's not really true. And so we do see, but as far as whether they change and then shift back, I'm not aware of any studies that have really made that argument, which isn't to say that there aren't studies. There are many studies on this topic, but I don't know of any.
Okay. She'll be here for a little bit longer just to answer any questions if you want to come up to her privately. And I want to thank Dr. Stigall
Thank you guys. These are great questions. You guys are a fun group. So take your fossil cards home, hang them on your refrigerator.